So you're all engaged now on developing your MBA project, and what we're going to do today to try and give you some insight, particularly into how today to use literature to inform your project in some constructive way. We're going to look at extracts, fairly short extracts because of the time we have available, from 2 different MBA projects produced by students in the past, in fairly recent years. These are both A-grade projects. So as usual, as you'll know my usual approach, I've chosen what I hope are fairly good practice examples for you to work from. Again, in my usual way, I'm going to try and blend some of my presentation with a little bit of thought-provoking activity for you as well. And obviously we are, kind of constrained by having to look through quite a lot of text. So, it's a big project, 12,500 to 15,000 words that you'll eventually be producing. So inevitably when I'm constructing a workshop around this, I feel that I have to try and base it around at least a reasonably substantial piece of text so that we can look at some examples of what have students done before about trying to bring literature and review of literature in theory into their projects. So I hope that you'll find that instructive in that way. I'm going to try and get you thinking about some of it while we're in here, but of course you will be taking these examples away with you, and you could choose then for a start to follow those up and have a look at more of those particular projects if you wanted to by accessing Virtual Scholar, which I hope most of you are familiar with the availability of now. So this is a virtual storage space on the school intranet which has copies of a lot of past students' dissertations and projects. Come in, Hatton. This is just a taster today, and if you find that you're particularly interested in one of these, for example, might be somehow kind of related to your own project area, then you might find it useful to go and look at those. Or if not, look at some others as models from that source as well. Come in. It's fine. So just to kind of explain a bit, what you've got already in your handouts are the abstract in full, so the full abstract, the set of contents, and a short section of extract from the literature review kind of area of 2 different projects. And in a few moments, I'm going to talk through myself what I think is in the abstracts, just to kind of, so we've all got a sense then of what's covered in these 2 projects, what they were setting out to do. And so it's probably worth me flagging up straight away that one of the projects is in a finance area, so I hope, no, it's not finance, I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up. One of the projects is in a strategy area. Amy, am I right? Strategy, would you call it? Yeah, sorry. In a strategy area, which we hoped would be kind of relevant to, what quite a few are looking at. And the other one is in the marketing area. So, we hope both of these have got some sort of general applicability and an interest to you. So we'll have a look at those in a moment. But in case I forget, before I start looking at that material, can I just flag up something as a resource that I do believe is worth you having a look at for general principles of how you're going about, in this case as we're talking about today, approaching your literature review, which is in particular one of the ELS one of the ELS booklets, writing your management dissertation or project report. So if some of you haven't seen this already, I think this section, particularly on pages 4 and 5, might help you concentrate your mind on the type of questions that you could usefully ask yourself when you're thinking about how to select and review and critically evaluate literature for your review. Okay, so I just wanted to flag that up. There are a couple of other ELS booklets as well on research methods generally, so some of you will be familiar with this. You can pick them up, as you know, from on site around the school, but also they're on the ELS website as well. So I just wanted to kind of flag that up for you. So without any further ado, let's have a look at these two examples we've got here. Now, as time goes on, I hope you'll see why I've chosen to try and look at two different project extracts today, which is going to make things a bit more, challenging for us to try and utilise both of them fruitfully, but I hope we'll be able to do that. And the reason really is because these two projects have taken somewhat different approaches to how they've incorporated theoretical ideas into their project. And so I wanted to kind of raise this in your awareness right from the beginning, that because the MBA project is essentially seen as a kind of problem-focused, company-focused thesis. I'll use the word thesis to talk about it generally. That does raise certain issues. So whereas last week I was running a similar workshop for MSc students on writing their dissertation, their requirement, which is a longer one, 22,000 words, is to very much undertake a theoretically informed research project. So that they have to look at a substantial area of literature and review that really very thoroughly for its own sake, to kind of show what the theory is currently in that field. Now, I believe that the MBA project is somewhat different from that, and this is a very important distinction for most of you here today, isn't it? That the chances are that you're going to be looking at a company and you're going to be looking at some kind of situation in that company and analysing that in some way, probably to come up with some kind of strategic recommendations for improving that situation in the future. And so really, my understanding at least of the school's expectations of what you're therefore trying to do with the theory that you still need to go and do some research into, is that you're looking for the theory to inform that study of that company, and how you're going to propose that they take some actions based on your findings. So from discussions that I've had just in the last few days, literally, with different colleagues who are involved with the MBA programme in some kind of official capacity, like your Director of Studies and the Director of Distance Learning MBA programmes and so on, who are each, of course, also supervising some projects and have had considerable experience of doing that. What I've met is a divided opinion about how you go about doing that. And that's kind of interesting in one way, and probably could be a bit challenging, maybe frustrating for you to quite know which way to approach this. So I've deliberately chosen two different projects for us to look at today side by side. I hope this works. It's an experiment. I don't know how well we'll get on with it within the time available, but I'm going to do my best anyway. To try and compare and contrast those two approaches. And essentially the distinction is that one approach taken by the student who wrote the one about turnaround strategy was to create a separate chapter in the project which is entitled A Literature Review. And it's essentially a discussion of the theory in this field of turnaround strategies. And my understanding is that that's one approach you could legitimately take. and has been undertaken quite successfully by a significant number of students who've gained A grades and merit grades in their project in recent times. So I think that's okay. The alternative, as exemplified by, hopefully as we'll see, the marketing type project, is that the student in that case has kind of taken the subject themes of what they're looking at in the marketing field, the specific marketing area they're looking at, and they've divided their project, as we'll see from the contents pages, into different elements, particularly of internationalization and global marketing, different elements of that, and they have interwoven the theory into each of those discussions, relating it directly to the company's issues about that as they go along through the way. And I've been trying behind the scenes leading up to this workshop to find out if there is a school sort of emphasis on which one of these is more appropriate, and I have not been able to get a definitive answer on that. So what do you think is the best thing for you to do about that? About making that decision? Some of you may already be committed down one road, and I'm sure that's fine. So my position is either of these could be okay. How do you think you're going to... Yes, Ankit.
For me, I'm doing a company project. So during my proposal, I thought about it, and because it's a very practical study that the company want to undertake, I decided to go the second way, basically that I'm not doing a full-fledged literature review. But what I'm doing in part of literature review is the external environment analysis. So because it's a marketing oriented project. So instead of going to the theory, I'm saying that, okay, I'm going to do the study of your external environment, and I'm going to refer back those models which I'm going to use. Because the models are in the books, so those models I'm going to use, and I will say these models are taken and these models are used.
Okay.
So that is my approach.
I think it depends on the type of project that you are doing. If it's a company related project, basically you would be looking more to study the problem of the company rather than what has been there in the literature or the research earlier. But if it's a desk based project or you are researching something, you would be more keen on what the literature says about it, or the past authors, or what has been published somewhere, to argue and counter argue your statements rather than focusing on, because there's no company involved in a desk based project. So your topic will be very vastly discussed within a group of people, and then you can take it forward from there.
Okay, Aravind?
I think it has a lot to do with the supervisor.
So do I.
Because
and not discounting what the other gentlemen have said, I think both of those are sound comments.
I mean, it's not good to actually contradict him going forward, because you have to get his support all the way to the end. So what I meant by is what he said would be easy for him to supervise, and what he thinks is the best. So considering his experience, I just said yes.
Yeah, I think this was the other. I think both the points already made are sound, and there's a lot of common sense in what's being said there, and I think we should take account of that. And then also, I did want to flag up the point that Aravind's kindly brought in as well, right from the beginning, that we have this somewhat strange situation in a way, don't we? That the person who is supporting you to some extent, guiding you, I think guiding is the word I'd like to hope applies, with supervision through the whole process, is then going to be the first marker assessing that. So I wonder if they have, for some reason, as I've discovered, different people that I've spoken to just in the past week here have different preferences for various reasons. I wonder whether that might have a bearing on your choice of how you approach it. I hope that they give you are willing to share some of that preference with you, so that might help you choose your direction. And I'm also aware that some supervisors will adopt the stance, quite justifiably as they see it, that it's your project, you decide whether the direction, maybe based on the kind of reasoning that's been exemplified already, If you can justify your choice of approach and explain that maybe in some background stage of the project description, then hopefully that's perfectly acceptable, anyway. Yeah, Asha.
Would it be alright to use a mix of the two, to have a section entitled Literature Review, and then at the end of that maybe put in a paragraph saying we'll be coming back to literature review as we go on? Because honestly I wasn't aware that the second approach is actually allowed, because I was told that, told as in what I heard from various cases around me and previous year students, that not everyone appreciates or accepts literature review in pieces.
Yeah, spread out a bit.
Spread out.
Yeah.
Could we
Well, I
do
suppose that just emphasises again, if you can at least check this out, try checking out at least once with your supervisor, running that past him or her, and seeing whether they have any particular objection for some reason to that. But I could imagine scenarios where that could be appropriate, dependent on the type of study you're doing, which is what it's always going to come back to, isn't it? Did you want to ask?
Yeah.
Yep.
What I was about to say, it also depends on the company person's requirements sometimes. Because in my company director has been giving similar projects from the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to know the theory bits and pieces in between, and he said you put all your theory in one section so that I just look at the marketing plan. He wants to know the direct application of it rather than you giving one paragraph of theory and then you explaining it, how it is applicable to the company.
Okay, yeah. This raises another interesting point, doesn't it, about who are you writing this project for then? And, because I don't want to spend too long on that discussion so we can get into this stuff, it is perhaps important, isn't it, for you to recognise that you might have two distinct readers. But I have to say, from my position, first and foremost, I wouldn't want you to lose sight of the fact that you're producing an academic piece of work here which constitutes 40 credits on your MBA programme. So you've got to make sure that you are satisfying the academic requirements here. So sometimes, as I expect you know, it's been the case that a student has produced a kind of abbreviated, summarised report for the company, but what I think would often be a more full, academically orientated project for the requirements of the school here. So that might be something to think about. And in fact, I know the person who produced this marketing report that we're looking at today, project today, did exactly that. He submitted a kind of more of a business report to the company, and in fact, as he says, I think even in the section that we look at today, this was some of his recommendations for internationalising the company's operations were adopted by the company and put into practice. So it was very successful in that way, but he also had to make sure that he produced a full 15,000 word academically informed or based report, project as well for here. So you need to be kind of aware of that, don't you, and work out what the best approach is. But in discussion with the managers at the company where you're basing it. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to flag these distinctions up for you, and we can be thinking about these, can't we, as we look at these practical examples. So let's do that now then, and let me talk you through my observations on both the abstracts first of all, and then I'm going to give you some exercises based around questions I've devised for you around the actual materials. But as far as the abstracts, let's start with the marketing one, delivering eco-friendly packaging to consumers globally. So, both the abstracts, this would be very typical of just a very brief overview of what the project has set out to do and what it's achieved. And, they would expect that this would come down into one single page, one single side of A4. So this is just something you're having at the beginning. But I thought it would be useful for us so that you can get a sense of what each of these were about. Because that's what they should do. They should tell us what this project was essentially about and what it found out, really, in brief. And I think the way that they've gone about doing this, in the case of the marketing one, is that, first of all, it states an opportunity. So I think that's the first sentence. I'd call it, in this case, I think he's looking at an opportunity rather than a problem, but you could say those are the same things in a way. So we've got to identify appropriate international markets for this eco-friendly range of products. In this case, he's actually then, this is kind of more unusual, he's gone straight on to describe the methodology that's been used to undertake this project, desk research, and this is then covered in more detail later on. And then he also makes a reference to the kind of literature that he's looking at. So that's kind of an unusual start, I think. But okay, he's telling us very, very briefly and succinctly, this is the way I've gone about trying to appraise this opportunity. And then he's reporting on the kind of analyses that he's used. So that's reminding me of what Ankit's already said about his marketing type project using things like environmental analysis. And from that, it has resulted in some findings. So I'm looking at the end of the second paragraph. He's come up quite specifically with a summary of the key findings, in this case, the primary and secondary markets identified for expansion by this company. And then he goes on in the third paragraph to highlight some of the kind of key factors that are then covered in the project about the strategy that they should undertake to exploit those opportunities in those new marketplaces, and finishing with a kind of saying that he's going to give key recommendations. So it's kind of the format I'm seeing following there is identify the opportunity, show the methods that have been used to assess that, to carry out the research, including what kind of literature I've looked at. These are the analyses I've done, and these are the findings that I've made, and out of that I'm developing a strategy for the company to follow. And even though this is a rather unusual kind of format compared to the other one we'll look at next, for me it still follows a kind of logical structure in the abstract. I mean, this is probably something you're going to write very near towards the end of your project, because then you know what you found out. So my purpose in showing you this today really was more for you to get a grip on what this project's been about. So if we just then contrast that with the turnaround strategy, I think this follows a very classic form of abstract structure, which is in this case identifying a problem in a marketplace, in this case, rather than a single company. In Taiwan, the security unit trust funds, as they're called, firms as they're called here in the West, their equivalents in Taiwan, experiencing financial crisis at a particular time, following, and then leading to a decline. So the project aim was to try and develop a strategy for companies in that kind of situation to deal with that sort of problem should it recur again, to kind of preempt, or accelerate their recovery from that problem. Second paragraph, therefore, goes on to describe the methodology used for the research. Again, we're coming back to that. And then the third paragraph talks about the findings, what the main outcomes of this project produced, relating it to the problems that first discussed, and therefore coming up with some recommendations at the end. So we've got a nice kind of logical process of problem, strategy, the methodology used for the research, the findings reached, and therefore the recommendations arising out of those. Now, somehow your project needs to replicate that structure, doesn't it? I'm not saying in that sequence necessarily, but that's what your project needs to cover. And I think if I can speak from my own experience of doing a PhD, which is of course a vast project, it's so hard to keep sight of all of this all at once. And even with something that I might describe as small as an MBA project of only 15,000 words, it's still going to get pretty unwieldy for you at times, isn't it? And I think it's very important that you have from the beginning some kind of clear structure to that, so that you're fitting things in where they belong as they arise. So what, of course, this results in detail then, if we turn over the page, let's stay with the turnaround strategy one, is a much more detailed set of contents. And we have 2 pages in this case, I think we're right saying, yeah, 2 pages of contents. Let's just look at the overall structure of that for a moment. Because I think, again, this is a classic kind of theoretically based project or dissertation structure. And what you've got essentially is a background chapter, and I would link together introduction and background together there. Okay, it's been split into 1 and 2, but you can see the introduction is literally a couple of pages. So what you have is a background chapter which is setting the scene of this is the area in which my research is invested. Then you have a literature review, and then you have a methodology chapter, and then it goes on to discuss the findings, or rather to present the findings, and then you have a chapter discussing the implications of those findings related back to the problem that you first set out to discuss, and it leads to some recommendations. That's a really classic research project traditional structure. And I think, if bearing in mind all the considerations that we've already mentioned, that's one approach that you could take. So what we're going to do in the case of this one is look at an extract from that literature review, which is just about the theoretical aspects of that area in a little while. We can then contrast that with the other one, the marketing type exercise project, which, as we said, takes a more thematic structure, I might call it. So there is a background, and within that background chapter he's included a section on the methodology, so he's kind of summarised that all together there. But then he's gone on and really looked at all of these different business topic areas. And under a broad heading of internationalisation, we've got lots of different things about market entry modes, internationalisation theories. We can see there must be some literature coming in there, but then it looks as if it's going back to other things that are more focused on the company area, and we'll see an example of that. So what I've done is I've taken an extract, which is what we're going to come and look at in a minute, from a section of that internationalisation of the firms, where we'll see, even within 3 or 4 pages, some of it's about literature, some of it's about the company and the business situation, and they're linked together. So that's going to be your choice about how you do that, whether you do some of both even, maybe, as Ash has suggested. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at together. Now, I think a point I'd like to make then is that whichever of these structures you use, I'm going to really recommend, and it's sort of something some of you will have heard me mention in other workshops around writing even the smaller assignments, that as soon as possible you identify as many of these subheadings as you can, and create a Word template document on your computer, which is eventually going to become your project of 15,000 words or something. And you start taking from your reading and your research into the company, your discussions with the company managers or whoever it is, the desk research, whatever you're doing, that you fit the stuff into those headings. So that skeleton is created pretty early on, and you start putting the flesh on the bones. It's a rather horrible metaphor that we use, isn't it? And you're building that up. I mean, that's where I'm coming from. I just think that's such a powerful kind of mechanism to use, partly to feel that you're getting somewhere as soon as possible, and also to get this structure evolving in a kind of logical way as soon as possible as well. The other thing I think it'll do, particularly in terms of literature review, though, is that if we take the turnaround example, and because we're going to look at the literature review chapter in a moment, we can see there that essentially there's 4 major topical areas to the literature review. There's internal environment, external environment, turnaround strategy, and the role of marketing. So even if you've got those 4 subheadings, when you start off doing your research into these theoretical, your reading around these areas, so that you can start fitting your referenced notes into those parts, pretty soon you'll be able to see which parts you've already got plenty on and which are still constitute gaps. And you can concentrate on filling the gaps after a while, rather than just sort of carrying on reading without quite checking back with yourself how much you're gathering in one area as against others, you know. That's my recommendation in general terms. Okay, so enough of that. Let's look at the specifics. So this is where, of course, I try and get you to do some work. I've set up some stages for you to read through the 3 or 4 pages of literature extracts that you've got in these 2 handouts, and I'd like you to just apply those, work through those stages, and to take it systematically. But once you've got the questions in front of you, I'll explain a bit more about that. Before you start, can I just flag up something I want you to think about? Well, I want you to follow a principle of here. Many of you will remember, I know a lot of you came to my reading strategy workshops, and we've had discussions as well individually about that since. You know that I'm very keen on this idea, and I try and push it at every available opportunity, of doing your reading in 2 stages, so that you read very fast the first time through something, just to get the context, to get, as we would say, the gist, the general meaning of something. So you will see that whichever one you're taking of these sets of questions, I've advocated the first question is that you read through through part of your part of your handout very quickly. And just try and read this question first, go into the handout with that question in your mind, and just find the answer to that question. Don't think about anything else, don't try and understand it all. You know, just try it once. I know you might not normally do this. Do what the question then asks for number 1, and then move on to number 2, when you'll have the opportunity to do more reading in more detail. So I might stop you after question 1 and get some feedback, possibly. So the question that's been asked is, how long should the literature... Let's say we're working with the model of you do a separate literature review like the turnaround strategy example. How long should that be? So let me put that back to you first of all. Let's assume your total project is 15,000 words. What proportion of that is going to be... 25%, I have at the front. Any advance on 25%? So I think anything that we say is only going to be a yardstick, but the sort of yardsticks that I've seen mentioned have been in the area of 20 to 25%. But I think you must really keep this proviso in mind that we've highlighted about. It depends on the nature of the research in your area, doesn't it? Yeah.
If it is research stuff, I think there's much to do with literature review than a management project.
Okay. So this is, you know, I cannot give you a definitive answer on this. It's a fluid area, but you know, something in that region of around 3,000 to 4,000 words, I think, is going to be where you're looking at. You know. Now, this is not, please understand, everything's got this proviso attached to it of, well, it depends, doesn't it, on what you're studying and whether it's company-based or more desk research-based, whatever. But of the one that we're looking at, which is the turnaround strategy one, The introduction was just very short introduction, about 500 words. The background was 2,000 words. So I would say the background chapter setting the scene was 2,500 words. The literature review was 2,500 words. The methodology was 1,500 words. The findings were 3,500. Discussions and implications, 3,500. So you've got 7,000. Yeah, okay, sorry. Well, I don't want you writing this down and going away and writing your project to exactly this word count. Okay. Please understand that, yeah. Okay, so I'll go back over it again. It looks like in this particular example, which is one that we are looking at today, we have 2,500 words background, 2,500 words literature review, and 1,500 words on the methodology. So that's the kind of, this is how I've gone about doing my project sort of stuff, isn't it? So what's that? That comes to 4.5. That's about 6,000 words, isn't it, on that, all that sort of stuff. 4,500. No, that's 6,000 so far, isn't it? No. Oh, sorry, 6,500. 6,500. Thanks, John. And then we have something in the region of 3,500 on findings and 3,500 on discussions and implications. So you've got about 7,000. So that's kind of the other half of the report is what have I found out, and this is what I make of it, and what I'm therefore suggesting the company might do. There is then a recommendations section of a further 1,000 words and a conclusion. So actually you're looking at something like 8,000 as against 6,500, for what I see as the kind of two parts of the report. But if you're splitting things across themes, as the other example looks at, then it's going to work out in a very different way, isn't it? You haven't got that classic structure to follow. So we understand that. Okay. Let me catch one or two ideas from different parts of the room. So I asked you to, just skim read the first section. What's the purpose of this sort of theoretical review in the first section, would you say? Yes.
It's basically giving the theoretical information about the topic that will then be approached throughout the whole report. So the first paragraph is about the concept of globalization. Then the next one about the challenges facing SMEs. Then the born global approach, which is used by SMEs, and how exactly this is managed within SMEs. And then international business strategy, and that is basically the conclusion of this theory so far, and how this theory has been used by the company that is going to be reported about.
So Lisa summarised that very nicely, I think. What we've essentially got here is, in one section on one particular issue, internationalisation of small to medium-sized enterprises, we've got a review of theoretical literature in that area, leading into a particular model, born global, isn't it, approach that's described. So that takes us in from a kind of generic overview of the literature on internationalisation of SMEs, down to this born global approach, down to why this is relevant for this company that I'm looking at. And that, even though we're getting this interweaving thing going through the whole project, we've still got within each section, if we take this as an example, and it is sort of replicated throughout, that you have a kind of, what's the theory in this area? What's the particular aspect of that I think's especially relevant to this company? Why is it relevant to this company? And then I'm going to go on and talk about how it could therefore work probably in that company. So we've certainly got, even though it's following this other kind of approach to incorporating literature throughout the project, we certainly do have a deductive writing approach going on here from the general theoretical towards the specific focusing in on the company. How does this theory apply to this company? So that's what's happening in the first part of this extract that I've looked at, and I think that's quite characteristic of the way that this student writer has approached the project altogether. Okay, let's look in contrast, is it? Is it a contrast to the group, somebody from the group at the front, which was looking at the marketing project? And the turnaround project, I'm mixing myself up now. So the turnaround strategy, I just asked you to kind of summarise. So have I got this right? Which one are you doing? Turnaround, yeah. Yeah, so again, it's the same kind of question really. What's the purpose of this first section? So for those of you, if you want to look across to the ones your colleagues have been studying, this is just the first page of, literally the first page of the literature review as a separate chapter. Who would like to offer me a brief summary of you? Yes, Andrea, thanks.
Usually when they start off, they want to find out the turnaround technique for the Taiwanese sector. So they start off with the definition and they give on the various authors what they have to say about turnaround strategies in the third paragraph. And then basically funneling it down, they exactly say what turnaround strategy they're going to be using in the particular sector that they're going to be working in for the Taiwanese sector.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So we have a kind of, well, yes, I think what's happening here is that's nice to see is that, first of all, the introduction to the literature review, and you're sort of some way on into the project there, immediately refers back to the original objectives of the project. And I wanted to flag that up for you to think about, really, that I'd guess that if there's one thing that your supervisors will keep on saying to you when you go back to them with questions about any aspects of the content of what you're researching and what it's showing you and how you use it, they will keep saying, what's this got to do with your research question? How does this answer your research objectives? What is it telling you in response to the questions that you set for yourself when you set out on this research exercise? So what I wanted to kind of really, I feel I must set as in a way the context of this whole discussion is that your research objectives should drive everything else you do throughout the rest of the whole piece. And I think it doesn't do any harm at all to start off a chapter on a literature review referring back to those, so you kind of saying to the supervisor, I know what I'm looking for here in the literature because that's what I'm setting out to find in the first place. So if you are still at all unclear about your research questions, objectives, focus, whatever you've chosen to call those, then you need to clarify that ASAP, I'd suggest. And in a way, I think that's, you could almost say, it might be the hardest thing that you have to do in the project. If I can speak from my own PhD experience, it took me about 2 years, literally about 2 years, to really refine my research questions and objectives. And in the meantime, I went all over the place, reading all sorts of things, and and I'm sure most PhD students will say the same looking back, and maybe some master's students will also say that with dissertations, that, I could have saved myself a lot of time if I'd known what I was looking for in the first place. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to pin it down because you need to get it narrow and focused because you've got limited time and limited word count. And when you start thinking, I've only got 2,000 to 3,000 words on my literature review, and I've got to review all the literature in a certain field, it better be a pretty narrow field, hadn't it, really? I think. So that's just something I wanted as kind of general observation.
I think here in the introduction, he has done this thing in a very wise way. So he has clearly specified 4 items.
Yes.
Which he is going to discuss, which he thinks would be the content, would be the factor that would contribute towards the turnaround.
Yeah, yeah.
focus is very important. So
Yeah.
he talks about after literature review, probably he'll come up with these 4 things,
Yeah.
which will drive the rest of the part.
Yeah, I think it's very clear. And it shows an immediate, simplified understanding of the key issues in turnaround strategy theory. And what the writer has done at the end, in the 4th paragraph, is they have summarised those key issues in the theory. And I would say the first thing that you're trying to do in a literature review, if we talk about it as a separate concept for a moment, is to summarise the key issues that have arisen and been agreed upon in this body of literature. So what I'm going to try and tease out in the, hopefully by the time we have remaining, is that I think there are sort of 3 or 4 key functions to literature review. And I think the first one, so this is my model, if you like, for what it's worth, is to summarise the major findings in this theoretical area of research. And I'm not suggesting that's a full summary at the bottom, but I think the student has taken a wise approach, just as Farhan said, of capturing some really core elements in very simple sentence structure. Great, I think great, because the tutor has read 1 page, only 1 page, and thinks, I think, at the end of that, thinks the student is on track here and has got the point of what turnaround strategy is about. There's some definitions in there already, you know, so we know where we're going with it. Good, yeah. Okay. Can I therefore now set you loose on question 2, which will take a bit more detailed reading in your relevant areas? Sorry, Pratik has a question.
How old those should be?
Oh yes, sorry. I will. Sorry, one point I meant to come on to while we talked about is general principle. Pratik's question is some of the. Which one are you looking at? The turnaround one. Some of these seem very old references, don't they? We've got 1976, 1982, yeah, for a start, certainly, and some bit more. I mean, I should stress this was written about 5 or 6 years ago, so this is an slightly older project. So we wouldn't be expecting anything after the mid-2000s, but, you know, I think it was written in 2006, something like that. So, going back to 1976, 1982, what do you think about that? Is that okay or not? Yes, Lisa.
Well, I think for most references we shouldn't go that far back, but I understand here why those have been taken, because I think it's definitions, and many definitions have been written down many years ago and haven't really been changed that much, so here it's okay to take those old references, I would say.
And I think it's a good idea to get the thoughts from some old authors or researchers and the contemporary research work and combine them together.
Well, compare and contrast them. How much is new contemporary research moving away from original, what we might call have been seminal ideas or articles in that field? You know, might go back to the 70s because that's the sort of, it's that whole field has been theoretically informed for so long by these core theories. You know, you might say something like in marketing analysis, Porter's 5 forces is something even I know about, you know, that you probably have to make reference to that, but then you'll be talking about stuff in the last 5 years, won't you, that's been somehow qualifying the use of that or something like that, you know. So I think you need a blend based on, again, always this, well, what's important in this field that still needs mentioning. But I know that your tutors will be expecting at least a reasonable amount of very up-to-date research. You're looking at pretty contemporary journal articles, aren't you? Okay, let me set you loose on question 2. As I say, we'll take a bit more time and see what we come back with from that. And what you can see I've been asking you to do in both groups is to recognise these different functions or purposes or types of, well, let's just stay with the word functions or purposes that different aspects of a literature review are trying to achieve. So I'm just going to talk through what I think we've got here. So I happen to have the turnaround one to hand first, so I'll speak through that and then I'll speak through the other one. So if you look at your turnaround handout, turnaround strategies handout, I mean, Lisa, I think it was, oh no, sorry, no, this is the other one, yeah, so this is the other one, so the group at the front's been doing. What I think we've got, if we look at page 14 as it's numbered, so that's taken directly from the project page numbers. What I think we get, first of all, in this very classic style of approach to a literature review is a separate body of theoretical work within one chapter within the project. What we've got quite typically is the first paragraph is a kind of historical development of the theoretical main theories in that field, in this idea of turnaround strategy. So we've got a kind of, saying this is where it first started, this is how it kind of developed a bit. I'm giving you, for a start, a couple of key authors who started doing theoretical research in this area. And it carries on then with a second group of researchers in paragraph 2, sort of started looking at things in a bit of a different way. So that kind of historical description of the main informants of that theoretical area coming along. So I think what's happening on page 14 and the first part of page 15 is synthesis. What I would call synthesis, bringing together the key authors' major ideas, findings in this field, and kind of comparing and contrasting them to somehow see if you can link together certain theorists who seem to be following one school of thought, other theorists who seem to be kind of perhaps coming at this from at least a partially different angle, and so on,
Looking for the similar patterns.
Yeah. You're looking for similarities and differences. That's what you're doing, yeah, exactly. You are comparing and contrasting to somehow synthesize together and say, here's the picture of the current debate in this field, and there are different perspectives in this picture. What are they in essence? And so you're doing some summarizing of the findings you're making from your reading in that and bringing them together and so hopefully fitting them together as much as possible. Please try and avoid a sort of listing approach, where you say, he says this, like a list. He says this, but then she said that, and he says this, and she said that. What we're really looking for is to go a stage further with that and say, well, how do these relate to one another? So I'm using the word synthesis or integration, might be the other word, to emphasize this kind of activity, not this kind of activity. Yeah, it's more about this. Easier said than done. Nice easy job for me is to stand up here saying, this is what you do, go off and do it. What I think then happens on page 15, halfway down, where it says recent developments in turnaround strategy, is what we could call, what I've called critiquing the theory. So we've said there's been some historical developments, this is what they mainly are. But then actually, some other people came up with some research findings which seem to not just sort of qualify other people's ideas, they actually seem to, in a way, contradict things in some cases and set up an alternative point of view. So you're still kind of pursuing that synthesis idea, but in this case you're really highlighting perhaps quite a different side of the argument for some reason. What we've said that this section already did was early on it summarised some major findings briefly, and then as you bring them in, charting the development of that theory and synthesising them together, you're still doing that summarising of findings, So this is all sort of happening at the same time. But I think you're summarising, synthesising and critiquing theory. So you're trying to bring it together and see how it fits. Who's agreeing, who's disagreeing, similarities, differences, that kind of thing. So if you're just talking about the theory, then that's what you're doing. If you're just doing a literature review chapter on the theory, then I would say essentially that's what you're trying to cover. And if you did manage reasonably well to do those three things, then you should be well on track, in my view. Of course, it all then hangs on whether you're reading the right things, whether you've got those key authors in the field, and that's the challenge, isn't it, for you? If we look at the other one then, so let me go back. So WeWow, I asked these questions, where can you find these things? So I think what we've got, Lisa gave a nice succinct description of this. We said, we're summarising some of the key theory. Yeah, so on page 14 we've got some basic stats, well not basic, but we've got some facts and figures kind of painting a picture of the current situation with internationalisation of SMEs. Sorry, that's on page 15, isn't it? It's called 15, yeah, sorry, not 14. 15. And then if we go over onto 16, so, I think Lisa's already described this for us. We've got, I would say again, summarising key aspects of the theory around SME internationalisation. So you see we've got citations cropping up here. It's sort of one citation at a time, so one person has been used to paint the picture of let me just remind myself, the threats and opportunities, the threats, the challenges, yeah. I'm going on then to talk a bit more about that in terms of the challenges from another author. So we've got a kind of synthesis of two different authors' ideas there. Then we go on to the Born Global approach, so I'm going over to page 17. And so I think then we're getting a more fully developed synthesis of the ideas around Born Global, who's contributed to that model, and that idea being adopted. So we've got a number of different citations here. So if we just look at that page, we can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5, maybe 6. Just in 3 paragraphs, we've got 6 different sets of authors contributing to this discussion around the Born Global approach. I think that's an interesting example of where the first part earlier on the previous page, which was just about the general challenges of internationalisation, you just need a kind of overview there, don't you, quite briefly. We've got a couple of authors' views on that. This is sort of accepted of the general situation. What I want to do is focus in on the Born Global approach, so I'm going to show you that I've read more about that from key authors in that area, because that's the model I'm going to now apply in the next section. So when we get to international business strategy, when we've been hearing about lots of theorists' ideas, we now get the application of Born Global, the application of a model, I'm calling it, if that's right to say that, to our company in question. So we've got that deductive process going on. The narrower we got, the more kind of sources we were looking to consult, and then we applied it to WeWow. And then he goes into a kind of recommendations, really. So he's applying the theory to the practice at this point, because he's doing this interweaving based around themes all the way through his project. Okay. So I'm now on page 19 of your handout. Sorry, I have to correlate it with my own. Page 19 in this strategy. So he's, by relating Born Global as a theory to his company, he's now taking it into saying, so this is what they should be doing. So he's gone from theory, very broad theoretical area about internationalisation of SMEs, into a specific model, Born Global. How does Born Global apply theoretically to this particular company? So therefore, what should they be doing? And he's going really into the practical application stuff of, this is the strategy I'm recommending now. And he's kind of doing that all the way through. What he then does is in section 2.5, he goes back out into international market selection as a kind of a new theoretical area, you might say, and he's summarising the key findings in a different theoretical area. So he's now, having gone right down, narrowing, applying into practice, now I'm going into another bit of theory, broadening that out. Here's some main observers in that field, and I guess he's going to go on and start applying that back to WeWow. So it's kind of going like that. Like that. After saying it was like that, I'm now telling you it's like this, so I don't know what you make of that. How extremely confusing, I imagine. Okay, right, so let's open it for some questions, because that was a bit of a race through, wasn't it, some of the things that we've looked at. But at least it gives you an opportunity to consider the different types of writing you've got here and what they're doing, and what I think you should be aiming for.
Regarding project proposal, at the end of the day, when we are submitting about the whole project, along with the project proposal, can we have some changes in the proposal? As compared to the first one we have submitted it initially and the last proposal which we are giving, can we have major changes in that?
Arman's question is, the project proposal, if as I go along I discover some other things I wasn't expecting to discover, which would be one of the points of doing research, wouldn't it? You're not going to know everything that you are setting out to discover, otherwise you wouldn't be needing to do the research, putting it crudely. So this inductive element to research, that things that you find through your data collection and analysis point up for you about what you realise you need to be looking at, is part of that research process, I think. So maybe that's the case. Certainly we can say that could definitely inform your literature review, for example. So I'm now going to reveal to you, Amy didn't want me to do this before, but the turnaround strategy project was Amy's project that she did when she did her MBA in 2006-07. Yeah. So if you had any specific questions, she'll be available afterwards. You can ask them about that. But one of the things she's just said to me is that in her literature review, as you see, the final part is about aspects of marketing and its relevance to turnaround strategy, and she didn't know she'd be looking for that until she gathered her data. So then she needed to go back and add in some literature review around marketing aspects related to these financial problems. So there is an inductive element, isn't it? How much that changes your research proposal, I'm not sure really. I think that's a harder question I find to answer, and something perhaps for discussion with your supervisor. I'm not sure how much notice they'll take of the proposal at the beginning and at the end. Okay, and further questions? Yes, Pratik.
Regarding the literature review, is it fine to, or is it acceptable to give your own points of view on some particular topic? Or suppose I say this particular author A suggests this, whereas author B critiques this particular point. So is that thing should come out, or I can say that author A says this, but I would say that this is not the valid thing.
Yeah, I think this is a very significant question and really, really worth paying attention to, and a hard one to answer as well. But my best stab at this is that I think what you must have, well, no, let me go about it another way. I don't think it's enough just to report the author's views. So this synthesizing, critiquing, summarizing, I think, yeah, that's all good. But actually, if you only do that, I'm not sure it's enough, because this is a unique project that you're producing to answer a very specific, probably unique set of questions and objectives, or certainly very distinctive set of questions and objectives. So your challenge is to relate the findings in the literature that exist already and the findings from your own research back to answering those questions. That's what you've got to do in your project. That's paramount for everything. So therefore, when you're reading other people's ideas, I think it then requires you, and you say, well, he's saying this, she's saying that. There seems to be a lot of support for this. In the last 5 years, we've had quite an interesting qualification where somebody's realised this doesn't apply in India or something, whatever. And so you then interpret the implications of those to your research questions and objectives. So that's where your view comes in, I think, is how and why is this relevant to my research study? And nobody else will have said that before, because this is your new study, which is meant to contribute something new. So your voice must, my short answer to your question really, Pratik, is your voice must be in there.
In the literature review as well?
Well, I think in the literature review as well, sure, yeah, why not? Why not start emphasising, even at that stage, how and why this is interesting for your particular study?
In case if we have recommendations in the end, that will form the recommendation throughout the entire project rather than specific things.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Because I think the tutor is especially interested in, so what are you making of all of this, Pratik? As you're reading this and considering this debate, what does that mean to you? What do you make of it? Yeah, I think that's very important, actually. Okay. Any more questions? Shall we leave it at that? Thank you very much for your attendance.